this is the story of my waking nightmare. Until about 2 weeks ago, I was employed as the head mental health counselor at a major university here in the UK. My job mostly consisted of coordinating sessions between counselors and students, although for 2 days a week I'd personally run sessions on a face-to-face basis with some of the more vulnerable students. Even in light of what's happened recently, I find my job extremely rewarding. Being a young person in a high-pressure environment such as university can take a very heavy toll on their mental health, and the fact that I've been able to guide so many of them to calmer waters is something I'll always be extremely grateful for. It's not always easy. My career has definitely had some ups and downs, but since hitting my 30s, I definitely feel like I've come into my stride. The fruit of this has obviously been my promotions, as I went from junior to senior advisor, and then a team leader in the space of just 18 months. I felt like I was running an effective, caring, and professional operation, but beginning about 3 weeks ago, my entire life came crashing down around me in a truly devastating fashion. Like I said, I can't refer to anyone by name, so I'll use the name Amy to refer to the student in question. Amy was a first year who'd contacted our team in early February, saying she was having a hard time coping following a breakup back home. I'm sure you can imagine how many of those we get on a yearly basis, and the vast majority are first-year girls like Amy. Generally speaking, a little empathy and gentle advice go a long way with young women in such predicaments. And although we try not to lean on the plenty more fish in the sea or no guilt for the guiltless cliches, the counseling of such a problem tends to be relatively simple and concise. I had no idea how difficult and dangerous Amy's counseling would be, but when one of my junior team members approached me with their own predicament, I was only too happy to assist them. It is, after all, in my very job description, that if a junior member of the counseling team is having trouble with a student, I step in to apply my experience and expertise. And when a junior team member was struggling with Amy, I relished the opportunity to build trust, apply leadership, and lessen their workload. But that proved to be one of the biggest mistakes of my life so far. My first session with Amy was fairly productive. We talked about her relationship, what it meant to her, and why it was difficult to move on from. I could understand why my colleague had such a hard time with her, as she was extremely emotional and very highly strung. My initial suspicion was that she was suffering from GAD, a general anxiety disorder. But before recommending any kind of formal psychiatrist appointment, which usually leads to prescription medication, I thought it would be best if we had 1 or 2 more sessions to see if we couldn't resolve things in a healthy, non-prescription manner. Again, this was a huge mistake. By the time the second session was over, I'd identified a few key issues that I believed Amy could work on in her own time. The first was that she seemed to absolve herself of any kind of personal responsibility, be it in her own now defunct relationship or in her home life. In short, every problem in her life was caused by someone else, even if she had to grasp for some abstract reason with which she could lay the blame. The second was that she refused to even entertain the idea that she might be able to identify any kind of solution on her own. In a lot of cases, answers are much more easily obtained within oneself. We generally don't need a library of self-help books or podcasts if we're brutally and sincerely honest with ourselves. This doesn't always mean the person themselves are at fault. For example, it might be that one has a detrimental person in their life who they refuse to leave behind. All you need is the self-awareness to identify that person, habit, or behavior, then the bravery to deal with them. Since Amy seemed incapable of such introspection, I knew it was something that I'd have to bring up with her, and fast if we wanted to make quick progress. So for our third session, which just so happened to fall on the day after Valentine's Day, I put forward a few of my uncomfortable observations. Now, as you can imagine, it's not nearly as simple as just telling the person, you have issues. This might sound obvious, but the idea with counseling is to actually counsel, not pass judgment, give direct treatment suggestions, or tell anyone what to do. The trick is to allow a person to come to a healthy conclusion on their own. This is just as true of counseling as it is of child rearing. A person must learn to be good voluntarily, not under duress. So, the way I usually approach something like that is to simply ask questions. Do you think you could do X, or can you see yourself doing Y? That sort of thing, simply worded, polite questions that provoke spontaneous thoughts and introspection. But when I put it to Amy that some of her problems might be of her own creation and that her inability to settle on a healthy coping mechanism was impeding any progress, she didn't take it very well at all. In fact, she not only saw zero merit to my polite suggestion, she took it as a direct, unsheathed insult. I know for a fact, with it being near Valentine's Day, her sense of loss was infinitely stronger than it was before, but it was still dismayingly surprising when Amy burst into tears, declaring that her visits to the university's counseling team had been counterproductive and a complete waste of time. Then, to my increasing concern, she seemed to enter a sharp downward spiral of negativity right there before my eyes. I tried my best to calm her down, told her to try the psychological breath technique, but none of it seemed to work. And suddenly, a mild jolt of horror went through me as she spat out the words of taking her own life. Despite the shock of hearing those terms thrown around so casually, I believe I'm fairly adept at dealing with threats of self-harm, and lo and behold, after a few careful minutes of sub-crisis management, Amy regained a degree of composure. Once her breathing was under control, she asked if she could use the office's restroom. Naturally, I showed her into the small restroom out in the common area, then told her she could return to my office whenever she was ready to continue the session. As I'm waiting for her, 5 minutes passes, then 10 minutes passes, then at 15, I actually thought she might have just walked out of the counseling office, having abandoned this session entirely. But the moment I walked out, Becky, the counseling office's secretary and also not her real name, shot me this puzzled look. "She didn't leave the toilet, did she?" I asked her. Becky just shook her head, and in that instant, the flash of fear I'd felt before boiled up into full-blown terror. I started banging on the door, shouting Amy's name and telling her if she didn't open the door, I'd call the fire brigade, paramedics, and anyone who could stop her from hurting herself. I rattled the doorknob, basically started punching the door, but no one said a word on the other side, and it gradually dawned on me that if I wanted to actually save this girl's life, I'd have to kick the door down myself. I'd never done anything like that in my life, and at 5'8" and 9.5 stone in weight, I don't think I'd actually be able to do it. Time and time again, I sent myself crashing into the solid oak, but it didn't so much as budge. At one point, I looked around to see Becky looking absolutely terrified, phone in hand, indicating she was already contacting emergency services. In the end, I didn't need to. The door swung open on its own, and when I saw the state Amy was in on the other side, I was almost propelled backwards in complete and utter astonishment. Amy was covered in blood. There was a large cut on her upper lip, one which had poured blood down her chin, neck, and chest. There was also visible bruising on her wrists and forearms, as well as a trickle of blood edging down from her hairline onto her eyebrows. I'm ashamed to say that the sight came with a sick sense of relief, knowing that she'd just been hurting herself as opposed to actually taking her own life. I knew she was in a volatile state. I knew she was suffering a deep emotional pain, but I never, ever expected to hear the words that came out of her mouth. "Ow! Stop hitting me! Please! I'm sorry! Ouch! Ow!" As she screamed, I watched in absolute horror as Amy grabbed herself by the fleshy part of her forearm and began to squeeze. I instinctively backed off, hands in the air, showing our similarly terrified secretary that I hadn't laid a finger on her. We both watched as Amy proceeded to throw herself into the heavy oak door, head first, and the impact was so forceful that Becky actually let out a cry of distress. She did it again, and again, and again, until I was forced to step in to physically restrain her. When I did so, she sunk her teeth into my arm so hard that I too let out a scream, and as I let her go, she tumbled into the arms of Becky and began weeping uncontrollably. I remember looking down at my arm and seeing the little flecks of blood that were forming in the indentations her teeth had left. Then, once Becky had assured me that the police were on their way, standing operating procedure in the event of a violent episode of self-harm, I retreated to my office to remove myself from the situation. It was a horrific day for me, without a doubt one of the worst in my practicing career. But again, I had no idea how bad things would really get. When the two uniformed officers showed up at our offices, I felt this brief sensation of relief before I heard Amy giving her very distorted version of events. Not only did she claim that I'd attacked her in the office restroom, but she also claimed I'd violated her in the most violent manner possible. I was stunned into silence, and if it wasn't for Becky giving her side of the story, I think I'd have been under arrest right there and then. One of the officers had a very intense look about them as they quizzed me on my bite marks, and like I said, if it hadn't been for Becky clarifying what had happened, I'd have been in a lot of trouble much sooner. As you can probably guess, the office restrooms aren't covered by cameras, and for obvious reasons, the camera in the reception area doesn't face them either. This proved a huge problem later on, but at the time, Becky's account was all I thought necessary. That was Monday, February 15th, the day after Valentine's Day. On Tuesday, I was down at the city's central police station, once again giving my version of events. The officer I spoke to seemed like he was on my side and that he understood Amy to be a very disturbed young woman, and for a while I think that was actually the case. On the Wednesday, I received a call telling me that there would be no further criminal investigation for the foreseeable future, and that the investigating officers understood what had actually happened. I was also asked if I wanted to press charges against Amy for biting me, and as much as I declined on compassionate grounds, I was told the university was probably going to exclude her for making a false accusation, not to mention damaging university property. That decision was simply out of my hands, and although it's not strictly how I'd have handled it, I appreciated their position. I believe that's what forced Amy's hand and motivated her to do what she did next, because her next move was to go public. The first I heard of it was when a colleague called me at about 1 o'clock on the Friday morning asking me if I had a Twitter account. I didn't, and I still don't, but that didn't mean I wasn't able to view the relevant tweets that featured a hashtag consisting of #arrest and then my name next to it. There were literally hundreds of those tweets, maybe even thousands of them, many from students at our university, but also hundreds from people who had just jumped on the vindictive bandwagon. It was definitely disturbing to see, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't affect my sleep that night. But I honestly didn't understand the true implications of such a misinformation campaign until the coming weekend. By that time, there had already been a miniature protest outside of the counseling offices, and with an incredible amount of ire directed at me, I tried and failed to enter. The result was that the university's administration had sent me home early, then called later in the evening promising me paid leave until the turmoil could be smoothed over. That was the first nail in my coffin. To the people in the know, it was standard procedure, nothing more than a way of protecting a valued member of the faculty. But to the Twitter mob, that was the surest sign of guilt so far. I hadn't been given paid leave to manage my stress. I'd been suspended pending an arrest and an eventual guilty verdict. The tipping point was when Amy directed the mob at our secretary, Becky, whose sole testimony had kept me from being arrested. I kept in touch with her, and although she initially promised to stick by me, I knew they'd gotten to her when she stopped answering my calls and texts. I don't know exactly how they threatened her or if the mob had found something to dangle over her head, but from what I heard, she spontaneously went to the police to change her official statement. After that, the case was reopened, and I was officially arrested for assault, and I honestly can't even bring myself to type it here. It's the part that really turned a horrific false accusation into the stuff of living nightmares. I'm simply incapable of that aspect of the crime, and I can't even get into the headspace of someone that would be psychologically able to do something like that. But one by one, my colleagues, my friends, even members of close family, I felt their opinions of me shift as the accusations began to mount, not just from Amy, but other members of the student body, and even a few local girls who I'd never even been in the same room with. When I tried to contact Becky again, when I tried to beg her to tell the truth about what happened that day, I was told that if I did it again, it would constitute witness intimidation. And that's where I'm up to. It's been almost a whole year and I still don't know whether this is actually going to trial or not. My solicitors think that once the mob's energy is properly died down and Becky is ready to come forward with the truth, then I'll be able to put this horrible chapter of my life behind me. I hope one day the truth of the matter will actually be reestablished, but honestly, I don't know if that day will ever come. There's obviously the complete lack of DNA evidence, and that's putting it as uncrude a way as possible, but I still have my doubts. And the way people have shown a complete lack of regard for evidence and due process has been one of the most terrifying and depressing aspects of my experience so far. I know in my heart of hearts that even if you actually read this mess of a story to your followers, some of them will just decide I'm a liar. They'll decide that Amy's side of the story, as weak and incoherent as it is the actual truth. And that, to me anyway, is far more terrifying than any ghosts, monsters, or magic. I recently watched your Places with Scary Backstories video, and most of it helped keep my mind off this whole torrid affair. But one story brought me right back to reality, the one about the Salem witch trials. Hundreds of years later, and the mob is still hunting witches. They still want to watch them burn, just as the mob wants to watch me burn too.
I went to university in London for about 3 years, and this happened in my final semester early on in 2018. The area that I lived in wasn't that great, to say the least. There were daily issues with catcalling, creepers taking photos of female students on their way to nights out on the weekends, and this wasn't even the first time that I'd been followed. It was just the worst. Often I would tell classmates stories about a creep that I encountered that day, and they'd ask what area I was staying in, and when I told them, they'd go, yeah, that's why I don't go there." I should also mention first that I have pretty bad anxiety disorder, and this day I nearly didn't go into university at all because I just had a really bad feeling. But if I listened to every single bad feeling I got, I'd probably never leave the house. So I shrugged it off and decided to make myself go to class anyway. My anxiety is so bad at times that it's hard for me to differentiate between a genuinely bad feeling and my brain going into fight or flight mode, for literally no dang reason. Knowing the issues of the area I lived in, I purposely dressed down as much as possible to minimize attention from creepers because I was in no state to deal with it that day. My typical look ventures into alternative style. Lots of black tattoos and dark makeup. You know, the works, which tends to get attention in itself, so on this day I purposely just wore jeans, a massively baggy shirt, and little to no makeup. I figured this would be enough for people to overlook me and just let me go about my day more or less ignored. Well, I was wrong. A piece of information that's really relevant to this is that there was a note emailed to all of the residents of my apartment block around this time. Apparently a man had recently attempted to assault a handful of girls from both our apartment block and another student hall apartment block around 10 minutes away. It also included a description of the man. Not even 5 minutes after leaving my apartment block, there's some guy following me. Now at first, alarm bells really didn't ring yet. It's pretty common for strangers to approach you in London, usually trying to sell something to you or just generally get money off of you in some way or another. So I hear this guy start calling after me.
"Hey, excuse me."
But I keep my head down and flat out ignore him, which is usually enough to put off anybody trying to sell you something. Well, when he then starts following me down the street and across the road, I knew this was a bit more sinister now. He's getting progressively more frustrated the more that I ignore him. His excuse me's becoming more insistent and eventually turning into,
"Oh, come on, I'm just trying to talk to you."
At this point, my heart is already racing like crazy. But I'm a big fan of true crime and I like to think I know the basics of trying to keep myself safe. Specifically when it comes to not falling into the trap of being polite, even when somebody's making you uncomfortable. And just after I cross the road with this guy still following me, I come into a series of small shops. They're not so small as to not have any security. Just the kind of place the people working in the area would stop by to grab their lunch for the day, and so on. Thinking of both the security guard and the security cameras, I walk straight into the shop, hoping that this would be enough to put the creeper off. Well, it's not. I go into the first aisle and pull my phone out, texting my dad to call me immediately. There's not much he can really do as he lives across the country, but I figured that maybe even seeing me on the phone will put him off, or that maybe I could say something like, "So you'll be here in 5 minutes? Okay, great." Hell, I mean, worst case scenario, I figured if something happened, I at least had some form of witness on the phone. My dad, knowing of the problems that I've had with creepers in the area, calls me immediately. We have a code for if I'm being followed so that I can tell him without being too conspicuous about it. But I'm way too panicked to care about being subtle. The creeper is now standing a couple of feet down the aisle, pretending to look at things, but mostly just staring at me. All the while he had his hood up, obscuring most of his face, which made me really uneasy. It was as if he was just as aware of the security cameras as I was. He matched parts of the description of the man that we'd been emailed about, but it was really hard to tell with his hood up, and he was also wearing a really thick pair of sunglasses which hadn't been mentioned in the description. As they were the most noticeable thing about him to me, I wasn't really sure if it was the same guy. When he realizes what I'm doing, he then disappears from the aisle, but I'm cautious and stay standing where I am. I was shaking and pretending to be fascinated by the bottle of Pepsi that was in my hand. All the while my dad tries to juggle comforting me, asking me questions, and giving me advice on what to do. Not even a full minute passes by before suddenly the creeper then reappears, and with a box of donuts in his hands. I turn to him and snap a "What?" doing my best to make it clear that I have absolutely no patience for him. He proceeds to ask me if he can borrow 20 pounds for the donuts. I give him an annoyed look and reply with an impatient no, doing really all that I can to try to make my 5'3" self appear at least somewhat intimidating. He does his best to appear hurt and offended, giving a
"Oh, sorry I bothered you,"
before putting down the donuts and then walking away in the general direction of the exit. Again, I'm not convinced. I stand in that aisle for a little while longer, telling my dad what had just happened and then move over into the next one, slowly scouting out the entire shop for any sign of him. I'm standing in the third aisle now when he then reappears yet again, slowly edging his way towards me. There's only one other person in the aisle, a shop employee that was stacking shelves, and I'm mustering up the courage to approach the worker and try to explain my problem when the creeper tries to talk to me yet again. Putting all of my adrenaline to use, I spin to face him and then snap out a "What? What do you want from me?" Keeping in mind all of the anti-creeper advice that I'd seen online about making it obvious that you would not want to be an easy victim in the slightest. And he seemed surprised by this, before mumbling out something along the lines of,
"I was just wondering if,
But I honestly couldn't make out exactly what he was trying to say over the sound of my damn heartbeat. So I look at him and then say sternly,
"Go away, just leave me alone."
To which he then returns to his shocked and offended act, then saying,
"God, okay, I was just trying to be nice here."
Which I respond to with, "Well, don't." And then he storms back down the aisle. I walked through the shop another 3 or 4 times to make sure he was really gone this time. All the while still on the phone with my dad before I finally check out and then peek out of the shop entrance. He's still hanging around and I have to choose a moment where he seems distracted by something so that I could haul my ass out of there immediately. I really needed to get towards the tube station. At this point, I was an absolute nervous wreck, and the only reason I didn't go straight back home was that I was absolutely scared that he would follow me. The entrance to my apartment block was in what can only be described as an alleyway. It was a spruced up alleyway which often had fellow students or workers from the area on their smoke break, but it was significantly quieter than the route to the tube station. I figured I'd just continue on my way to university, which would at least get me out of the neighborhood for a few hours. Plus, it'd also give me the chance to see my friends and get some in-person comfort over what had just happened. My dad stayed on the phone with me right up until I was on my train, and I was looking over my shoulder the entire time, expecting to see the creeper follow me again. Now, I can see how this might have sounded like my anxiety blowing things out of proportion if this was my last encounter with the creep, but it wasn't. The following week, on the day of that same class was canceled, so I spent the day in my flat, generally being just an antisocial hermit. The week after, however, same day of the week, same time of the day, I was leaving again to go to class, certain that the encounter 2 weeks ago was just another charming story to add to my collection of gross encounters from the area, when not even 5 feet from the door of the apartment building, somebody falls into step with me. It's really not too unusual. With other students in the building, I figured it's just somebody who had a class at the same time as mine making their own way to the tube station. And that's when I hear,
Hey, do you remember me?
I look up and I can't even manage to keep the dread from my face when I then see the creeper from 2 weeks ago. Right away, I tell him to go away, remembering how it worked the last time, but not this time. This time he doesn't even attempt his shocked, offended act that he played in the shop, and instead even seems amused by this. He instead then says, I'm just walking this way too. So I halted my steps and just gesture forward, then saying, Go on then, figuring if he's telling the truth he'll keep walking and continue on ahead of me. Well, he doesn't. Instead, he just stops and smiles. It was that same freaking amused, sinister smile as before. And then he says,
Come on, why won't you talk to me?
Which I then respond to with, Just leave me alone already. But I'm getting more and more freaked out by this creep, and it doesn't come out anywhere near as harsh as I wanted it to. He then does that creepy smile yet again. At this point, I start walking again, knowing that when I turn the upcoming corner, we'll be facing a music venue, which pretty much always has either security or some kind of janitor right outside, figuring I can just go up to them and ask them for help if he doesn't leave me alone. He keeps trying to talk to me.
Do you have a boyfriend?
I'm tempted to say yes, hoping it'd get him to leave me alone, but I know that it'd more than likely just probably lead to even more questions. How long have you been together? What's his name? And probably just a bunch of other creepy invasive questions from there. This guy doesn't even care if I have a boyfriend or not. He's just trying to draw me into conversation. Every time he tries to swerve a little, so he's now walking parallel to me, just closer. I take a few steps away. I start to get more nervous and respond to that question with, Oh, screw off. But he just keeps firing questions like,
Why don't you talk to me? I just want to talk to you. Don't you like talking to people?
But by now we're rounding the corner and I now spot a security officer. I immediately pick up my pace, going down a set of stairs that led towards nothing but the security guy, so that it's obvious what my intentions are. The creeper quickly says,
I'll just leave you alone then. You clearly don't want to be friends.
He then disappears and I speed walk down the street to the shop that he'd followed me the first time. It's only when I'm outside the shop that I decide to stop and look around. He's nowhere to be seen. If he really had just happened to be walking in the same direction, I would have still been able to see him because there's literally nowhere else to go from where I was walking. Which meant for me to not be able to see him, he'd have to have done a U-turn and started walking in a completely different direction altogether. After much pleading from my family and friends, who were really worried that this creep would show up again the following week since this was 2 separate occasions on the same time at the same day, I went to the reception staff at my student halls. I told them about the incident and they put me in touch with the police to make a report about it since they thought it was the guy who we'd been emailed about. The police were, well, nowhere near as helpful. In fact, they didn't even get back in touch with me after I emailed them an entire account of what happened. The following week, my dad drove down from across the UK to walk me to class with no sighting of the creeper, and for the rest of the semester I left over an hour earlier than usual for that class and just hung around campus to waste time. The silver lining was that this whole thing really made me appreciate my family because they ended up memorizing my entire schedule, always making sure that I had a relative available to stay on the phone with me from the moment I stepped out of the flat to the moment that I was on my train and vice versa. I honestly thought that was the end of the entire thing, until a few months later. I was now graduated and moved back to my hometown when I then get a text from my best friend. It's a link to a news article about some pervert who had been in court for assaulting students in my area. And with the article, she then sent a text that read, "So, is this the guy who was following you?" The article had a photo of the man that it was about, and it was indeed the creeper that had been following me that whole time. And it was also the one we'd been warned about via email. He didn't have the glasses on that he'd had when he was following me, which made me think it was some kind of disguise, seeing as he was apparently already banned from being near any student halls at the time that he'd been harassing me. The article explained how the creep had started following other girls from the exact same spot that he started following me, only they did what I didn't. They were polite. Of course, I'm absolutely not blaming them for that. I was just really fortunate to have it drummed into me by a protective dad and an equally overprotective older brother. Screw politeness. It's better to be accidentally rude to somebody with good intentions than to give the benefit of the doubt to an absolute psycho. So when he plied them with question after question and they'd warily answered, he'd always ask them,
"Where are you going?"
and whatever they responded with, he'd then tell them,
"No, you're coming with me."
and make a grab for them, assaulting some of them. And you want to know the worst part of all this? He got no jail time. He was given a curfew demanding that he'd be home before 6 a.m. and after 6 p.m. And I'd also like to add that in the same article, the police officer who hadn't been fit to bother calling me back about my report actually congratulated himself and his team for how well they handled the whole thing. What a load of crap. I'm still really working through severe anxiety issues, especially when it comes to being out in public alone. I'm never living in that city again.
Valentine's Day is a time for love and showing emotion and gratitude to that very special person in your life. 4 years ago, my girlfriend and I decided to go out for Valentine's Day. Where we live, it is still fairly warm in February, so I decided to take my girlfriend on a picnic that we had been planning for about a week or so. My girlfriend and I love being outdoors, and I figured after the picnic, perhaps we could walk on a trail or perhaps take a quick hike. About a month ago, while I was hiking, I found this amazing spot where I thought we could have the picnic. From one of the main trails, it only took about 15 minutes to walk there, and it wasn't that hard of a walk either. You did have to go off of one of the main trails, around a semi-narrow bend and leading to a small rock formation. The area overlooked our home. It was a beautiful view and enough flat land where we could sit and have a really nice picnic. I set up an entire area for us, chairs, tables, and a bunch of our favorite snack foods. On the rear side of this spot was more woods, and even in the daylight there were so many trees back there that it seemed dark. So when Valentine's Day finally came, we set off for our adventure. Thankfully, it was a beautiful sunny day. It was warm with a nice breeze and not a cloud in the sky. We held hands on the trail until we got to the spot where I went off the trail. I told her to trust me as we went off the path. She was hesitant, but was down for the journey. Just as I expected, the short trip was easy for her. We reached the spot in no time, and she was blown away. She just stopped and stared out at the horizon in awe. When she saw the spread of food I had, she was even more blown away. Today could not have gone any better, and in almost a blink of an eye, that changed. While we were laughing and staring at the beautiful view, she stopped suddenly. I asked her what was wrong, and she said that she had heard something in the woods. I looked behind in the dark trees, but saw nothing. I told her she was crazy, just kidding around, obviously, and tried to go back to flirting with her, but she wasn't having it. She insisted that I checked out the woods. So, annoyed more than anything, I told her I would. I got right up to where the tree line started, and I peeked through some endless amounts of trees. I saw nothing. If I'm being honest, I had a really hard time making out anything in there, but I truly didn't see anything. She approached after a minute or two and said in a terrified voice, "Right there. You don't see that shape? It looks like a person." I squinted and tried to make out the shape. It just looked like a shadow to me. "Babe, I think that's just a shadow," I responded in an almost condescending voice. She was hysterical and asked me to please look at it. So I stepped into the dark forest, and to my absolute fear, the dark figure moved. It was very slight, almost like a shoulder shrug, but I saw it. At this moment, I felt intense anxiety and fear, but I didn't want to freak out my girlfriend, or even worse, alert this potentially dangerous person that I knew that they were there. After only a couple of steps, I told my girlfriend I needed something, and I turned back to where we were sitting. I grabbed my girlfriend and tried to tell her not to freak out, but that I did in fact see a person in the trees. She was crying hysterically, and I was just trying to think of the best way to get out fast. I looked down over the lookout, but it was just too steep. The only way was the way we came, which was fine, but I just didn't want this lunatic to follow us. I decided to leave all the stuff behind and start walking down the rock formation. She went down first as I stared into the trees, and that's when I saw it clear as day. This shadow figure was definitely a man, and he was approaching us now. He was only about 45 or 50 feet away. I couldn't make out any specific details, but it looked like he had a beard. I finally started going down the rock formation, and I told my girl to run as fast as she could. We made it to the trail quickly. As we stopped to catch our breath, we heard the rustling of trees and the crack of sticks. This man was chasing us. She pulled out her phone to call the police, but apparently she didn't have a signal. Of course. We finally reached the parking lot of the park trails, and there were 2 police cars. The police were already looking for someone. Apparently, there was a woman jogging the trails early in the morning and found a man laying off to the side of one of the trails. She called the authorities right away, and the man reported being mugged and robbed. We told the cops everything, but by the time they got into the woods, they couldn't find the man. From what I understand, they never caught this crazy person in the woods, and I'm not sure what he would have done if he actually caught up to us. I still can't believe my girlfriend spotted him from so far away, and I'm so thankful she did. We both have a really hard time going on nature trails now, and I still have yet to return to that specific park. From now on, we decided it was best just to stay indoors, especially for Valentine's Day.